A while ago I saw a video from 3x3 Custom that showed a pretty nice joint, and I immediately had the idea for this coffee table. In a dark and messy corner of our garage I found this glass plate. It has moved with us 2 times without being used, and now it was time to change that. Solid wood, fancy joinery, Kumiko and glass on top of it, I was pumped to get this project started. I decided to make the table construction out of oak and use walnut as a contrast for the Kumiko. After selecting an oak slab that has very straight and rift-sawn grain, I marked where to cut off the ends and the rough length of the parts. With some cutoffs I lifted up the slab so I could cut it with my jigsaw. The piece had a crack lengthwise, and I could simply kick it in half, making myself feel incredibly strong. At the end of the black walnut slab, there was a pretty nasty piece of metal I wanted to remove before cutting it up. That took way more effort than I had expected. With all the lumber in my shop, it was time to crush some live edge epoxy river dreams. I marked where to saw off the live edge and all sapwood. For the walnut that was pretty unfortunate, since the sapwood almost made half of the slab. I think this design really calls for quiet grain, and the bright contrast of the sapwood would ruin it, especially in the Kumiko panel. I inserted a rip-cut blade into my table saw, attached the dust hood, and with Fritz and Franz I could cut to my lines. There are those jigs with the green strip. A little snack and I was ready for the remaining rip cuts. One of the cool things about Fritz and Franz, besides saving my fingers, is the fact that I can line up my marks with the edges of the jigs. Milling the lumber is probably my favorite part of a build. Seeing that grain clearly for the first time always gets me excited. I jointed one face and one edge before transforming the beast into planer mode. Then I planed the second face side of the oak down to 44 mm. I will deal with the walnut later. I set my fence of my table saw to 66 mm, registered the planed edge against it, and set my blade height so the board can clear the hood. I made a slow and steady cut in order to get a clean result. With the miter gauge in place, I established a square end so I could flip it end to end and cut the pieces to length. I did this for the 4 legs as well as the 4 stretches. The size of the table was pretty much dictated by the size of the glass plate. The joinery looks fancy, but it consists only of 2 setups at the table saw. It's all about thirds, as you will see, so bear with me. Every piece of the 3-way joint should look like this. To achieve that, I first remove this area and in a second setup this. Okay. Let's lay this out. The blanks are all 44 by 66 mm, or in another way, 2/3 by 3/3. With a marking gauge, I take the smaller side of the blanks, which equals 2/3, and transfer it for the first part of the cut, registering the gauge on the end grain. With the same setting, I can also mark the center 1/3 of the second part. By making marks from both sides, I end up with 1/3 in the center. This needs to be done on the face side and the end grain. Are you still with me? Now I have to set my gauge to 1/3, and therefore I can use the lines on the end grain. With the 1/3 setup, I only need to mark the depth of cut of the first part, on both edges and the end grain. The last step is to mark the depth of the second part, which is 3/3. I could simply take the wider side of the blank to set up my gauge. That whole marking process only needs to be done on one part or a test piece, as the table saw ensures repeatability. For the first cut setup, I lined up the mark with the saw blade and put my rib fence into position. Then I set the height of the blade to the appropriate height and made 2 test cuts. One to check the height and one to check the fence position for the shoulder cut of the joint. When both are spot on, it's time to cut the actual workpieces. I make the shoulder cut, which is the cut that matters with this setup, and then nibble away the remaining waste. By using a flat top grind blade, I end up with almost no cleanup work afterwards. A dado blade would really speed up the process, but I don't have one. Yet. For the second cut setup, I attached a jig I originally made to cut dovetails on the table saw, but I found it to be very handy for all kinds of joints. You can find the video on how to make the jig at the top right of the video or in the video description box. Alright then, with the workpiece on the jig, I set the stop so my marks line up with the blade, and make a test cut to check it. Then I raised the blade and made a series of cuts until the height was just right. Oops, that was too high. Spot on. With this setup I could establish the cut in my workpiece, flip it over and make the second cut. All my parts looked like this, and to get rid of the waste I removed the stop block and turned the waste into sawdust. Nice. Remember that piece of walnut that should become Kumiko? After edge jointing, I turned to the bandsaw and set the fence to 12 mm. Slowly and steadily I sawed that board into 2. Getting started with Kumiko can be a challenge. To make your first Kumiko a success, I make these Kumiko starter kits. They have everything you need, the guide blocks, the strips and the grid pieces. You only need a sharp chisel, so go and check them out in the store. With the jointer and planer I cleaned up the bandsaw marks and planed it down to 10 mm. To cut the grid for the Kumiko panel, I took half of the walnut boards and set my Kumiko grid jig up at the table saw. The jig is simple and very similar to a box joint jig. It's a strip that attaches to the crosscut fence and has this indexing pin. I wanted my grid to be roughly 42 mm from outside to outside of the square. With a digital caliper, I adjusted the position of the indexing pin and clamped it tight. To set the blade height, I set my depth gauge to half the material thickness, which equals 5 mm. On a scrap piece, I made a test and measured the depth of cut. 0.06 of a millimeter off, I'm fine with that. I registered the walnut board against the indexing pin for the first cut and turned to my phone to check my Instagram. Hey, get back to work, you lazy slacker. After each cut, I lifted the board up and didn't run it back over the blade, since this can widen the slot and result in a loose fit. For the next cut, I registered the previous slot on the indexing pin and worked my way up the board. At this point, it looked more like a fretboard of a guitar, and yes, I do have some serious air guitar skills. To actually cut the strips, I used a perfect size Kumiko strip as a spacer to get the fence into position. The strips need to have the same thickness as the saw curve I've just made. And then I ripped and ripped and ripped until I ran out of boards. Strips for the grid and some strips for the insole pieces. To glue the grid together, I applied glue with the help of a toothpick to the half flaps. After doing a few this way, I realized I can apply glue to a bunch of strips at the same time and make the process a bit less tedious. Smarter, not harder. With a block of wood and a few gentle taps with a hammer, I assembled the grid. In the end, I had a bit of a bow in my panel, and I assumed it was due to the strips being a teeny tiny bit too thick. While the glue dried, I turned to the infill pieces. To get the pieces to a rough length, I like to tape them together and cross-cut them at the table saw. Granted, I don't wear my safety glasses as much as I probably should. But when dealing with small pieces like this, it is important to put them on. Every now and then, a piece catches the blade and launches straight back at me. With a stick, I move the pieces away from the blade, and the deflector wedge at the back of the blade prevents the pieces to grab the upcoming saw teeth. So satisfying to watch the small parts flying away from the blade as they are being cut. I made about 800 longer pieces and 150 shorter ones. Before beveling almost 1,000 pieces, I took the time to sharpen my chisel. The angle this pattern requires are 75, 30, 60 and 45 degrees. I started with a 60-degree block and set the stop in a way that the longer infill pieces stick out just enough so I can make a full cut. With the chisel, I pry off the end. Now the pieces look like this. One down, 799 to go. I like to make multiple shallow passes instead of one aggressive. The chisel stays sharper longer and the cut is much cleaner. During this meditative work, I like to listen to audiobooks or woodworking podcasts. The next angle is 30 degrees. I set the stop so the apex ends up roughly centered and make a test piece. Looks just fine. I repeated the step for all the 800 infill pieces. This is how the diagonals meet. To bevel the meeting ends, I took the 60-degree block again, and with a little trial and error, I determined the perfect length. Not quite there yet. A small adjustment. Another cut. And no gaps. Here, here and here. After going through all 800 pieces again, the 75-degree angle was next. Here, the apex has to be centered once again. Like that. I might have watched some series to help me repeat this 800 times again. The 150 horizontals were a piece of cake. Just two 45-degree angles at each end to make them fit snugly. Oh yeah, just like that. With a few pieces of blue tape, I marked which squares to fill with the pattern. I wanted to fill the complete grid, but I just hadn't had enough walnut at hand. But I'm glad I didn't. That would have been about 2,000 Kumiko pieces. With a bit of glue in the glue tray, I dipped the pieces into the glue before putting them into their grid squares. My older daughter wanted to help me out in the shop and did a fantastic job of hammering in the horizontals. But we have to work on these fist bumps. For the center of the panel, I went with the Asanoha pattern out of oak. I have another video that explains this pattern in detail. To inlay the glass plate, I put it on the table and aligned it flush to the joints. I scribed a line around it and marked my waist. I measured the thickness of the Kumiko panel and the glass plate with calipers. And at the router table, I set my depth of cut a hair proud of that. I moved the fence so it would align with my marks on the table parts. On the stretchers, where the wider side points upwards, I routed from front to back. On the other two stretchers, I made a plunge cut, since a through cut would have taken off the joint part. I will deal with the remaining waste after the glue up. To get the Kumiko to the right size, I laid the glass plate on top of it and arranged it to be centered. I made small tick marks, clamped a piece of plywood with a straight edge to the marks, and used it as a saw guide to trim the panel to its final size. Before the glue up, I gave all the parts a sanding up to 220 grit. Looks like I was listening to a good song. If you want to keep watching woodworking videos just like this one, make sure you're subscribed to my channel and activate that notification bell. Thanks! The glue up was rather intense. A lot of glue surfaces that needed to be covered. With a band strap clamp around it and some pipe clamps, I held the parts in place while the glue dried. Then I could chisel out the corners so the glass plate and the Kumiko panel can go in. I'm not perfect, and so is my joinery, unfortunately. To fill the gaps, I sawed some wedges with this jig at the bandsaw. I covered them with glue, hammered them in, and after the glue had set, trimmed them flush. Time to add some pop to the joinery. Into the unfilled corners of the joints, I glued the walnut cubes and used the band strap clamp again. To give the joints their final shape, I connected the outside corners with a marking knife to get a triangle and sawed to my line with a pull saw. The edges received a light chamfer with the router, and all surfaces another sanding of 220 grit. For the finish, I went with Osmo's top oil, as usual, and started by applying it with a rag to the inside corners. I just applied one coat. Are you ready for this? Time to lean back and see some beauty shots of this coffee table. This is one of my favorite builds so far. I really enjoyed making the Kumiko panel, and I'm thrilled about these little walnut triangles at the corners. The joinery looks so complex, but when you break it down, it all comes down to 2 cuts. You might want to give it a try for your next project. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this build as much as I did. If you want to get started making Kumiko, pick up a starter set over at the store. See you in the next video.